Okay. Sorry for all of that. All right. So tonight I've titled my talk, Are the Gospels Reliable? And it's the little things. And we'll find out as we go through tonight what I mean by the little things, because that's not obvious until I tell you what I mean by it. So you'll see as we go through. We'll get plenty of illustrations. Why do the Gospels matter? Let's just start from that point first. Why should you even care about the stuff that I'm going to talk about tonight? Well, first of all, the Gospels tell us who Jesus was when he was here on earth. The Gospels tell us what Jesus taught. So if you find someone coming to your door, that person is, let's say, a Jehovah's Witness, and that person says, Jesus isn't God. Jesus never claimed to be God. You want to be able to point to what's in the Gospels and say, yeah, he did. He said, before Abraham was, I am, and so forth. The Gospels show us what Jesus was like so that we can follow him. So the Apostle Paul said, be followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. How are you going to know if your leaders are following Christ if you don't know what Christ was like, right? So that's important. And then Paul said that he wants to know him. That's like so important to him, that I may know him. Well, we want to know him, so we want to see what he was like. And the Gospels show us that right while he was here on earth. And the Gospels tell us about how Jesus rose from the dead and how he appeared to his disciples. That's important because the resurrection is the central miracle of Christianity. And if somebody says to you, oh, he appeared to his disciples in a spiritual sense, but not in a physical sense, how are you going to refute that if you can't say, wait a minute, he ate fish with them. He invited them to touch him, and so forth. So you need the Gospels for all of these things. So the Gospel's reliability is at the heart of Christianity. It is central to Christianity. You can't say, well, I'm a Christian, but it doesn't really matter whether the Gospels are reliable or not. That's not really all that important. Okay, well then, they're important to us as Christians, but what makes them different? So somebody could say to you, and probably someone will one day say to you, well, Mormons have their holy book, and Muslims have their holy book, and, the Gospels, the Bible, including the Gospels, that's just your holy book. Why is it any better than theirs? Would you have anything to say? You might say, well, this is the real one. This one was given by God. And at that point, our imaginary person says, well, yeah, that's what the Mormons say. That's what the Muslims say. They say theirs is the real one. What if someone said, well, the Gospels are composed of legends that were made up about Jesus way later on? What would you say then? No, they're not. Okay, why not? Okay, so you want to have an answer. And 1 Peter tells us we need to be ready to give an answer to everyone who asks us the reason of the hope. So it's good to have information that allows us to defend our faith. And that's the kind of thing I'm going to try to talk about here tonight. Now, so we're talking about confirmation of the Gospels that doesn't require you already to accept them. But I do find that sometimes people, they're interested in that, and that's good for them to be interested in that, but they're not quite looking in the right place. They'll often say, well, are there non-Christian authors who tell about Jesus' miracles? So what they're sort of looking for is someone who's not a Christian, but who says, yeah, there was this guy, and he healed the sick and he raised the dead. And his name was Jesus of Nazareth. Well, one immediate problem with that is that if somebody said that, he probably would be a Christian author, right? If somebody actually believed that, oh, sorry, now he doesn't count anymore. He's a Christian. Well, okay, but then people say, but what I mean is somebody telling that it was reported that he fed the 5,000, that he was reported that he healed the sick and raised the dead, even if the person doesn't necessarily believe it. And we would probably get that today. If there were someone here in in Kalamazoo who was claiming to have fed 5,000 people all at once just by handing stuff out, it would probably rate a local news story, even if the author of the news story was not necessarily accepting it. The person would say, I'm here interviewing some of the people who claim that this person fed 5,000 people. So where's that? They'll say. That's what they want. Well, part of the problem is there was no live blogging at the time. There was no MI Live for Jerusalem. I guess it would be JER Live or something like that. There was nothing of the kind. There were no daily newspapers. And we have very few books even left at all from that time. We have about one shelf, probably, even shorter. My husband's showing me one shelf like this short, remaining of books from the time of Christ throughout the Roman Empire, including a treatise on agriculture and a play by a very disreputable guy who worked for the Emperor Nero. So these are not even all of the same kind as the Gospels, and that's all we even have. So a lot has been lost. So when you put together the kinds of things they didn't have and the very small amount of materials that survive from that time, it's actually very unlikely. Consider, too, that this region was not considered a very important part of the Roman Empire. It's not like Rome was sending correspondents, as it were, over there to hang around in Galilee and to say, what's going on? What's going on there? Please send regular reports of what's been anybody important and what's happening and what people are saying about him. Nobody was doing that. So looking for somebody who's directly talking about the specific events of Jesus' life is not the way to be looking for confirmation of the events in the Gospels from outside sources. Now, the Jewish historian Josephus, who lived shortly after the time, he lived during the time of Jesus as well, but was prominent somewhat after the time of Jesus. He does mention Jesus, only briefly, and that he had existed. Really don't get very much from Josephus, but I mean, you'd have to be really crazy to think Jesus didn't exist at all. We don't get from Josephus any details, okay? And obviously, he doesn't believe that he performed miracles. Well, one thing we need to realize is that we actually have 4 sources for the life of Jesus. And it's very tempting to say, no, we don't. We just have the Bible. Well, the Bible wasn't all written at the same time. As a matter of historical sources, we should think of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John as 4 different historical sources. Again, not for the moment thinking of them as being God-breathed, but for the moment just thinking of them as being historical documents. We have 4 historical documents of the life of Jesus. And that's a lot. That's a remarkable number for any ancient person at all. To have 4 sources that allegedly come from people who knew him personally, or at least in the case of Mark and Luke, who knew people who knew him personally. That's kind of an amazing number. The best kinds of outside confirmations of the Gospels are what I call the little things. These are incidental confirmations, and we'll see tonight what I mean by that. In a sense, these are extra good because they're subtle and they're indirect. So an author who confirms one of these, who gives us one of these little bitty details, he can't be accused of a bias, or, maybe some Christian wrote that and inserted it into his text. Skeptics will say that sometimes, because they didn't even know that this was going to help to confirm the Gospels. We'll see how that works. And the Gospel authors themselves are often being subtle. The best evidence, or at least some of the best evidence we have for the Gospels, is the subtle evidence, where they're not out there sort of trumpeting and saying, hey, look, this confirms me. All right, These are very hard things to get right, we're going to see. Just like there's no live blogging, no daily newspapers, there's also no Google. Oh, you say, I remember a time before Google, so do I. But we had encyclopedias. There aren't any encyclopedias either. There aren't any atlases. There aren't any farmers' almanacs. Let's see, I want to find out what direction you go to get from this town, and is it uphill or is it downhill? Nope. I'm just going to go down to the library and look that up. Nope. No reference libraries. Now you'll hear, oh, there was the great library at Alexandria or whatever. Yeah, that's not a thing that you got a little library card to and that you could just drop in on a Wednesday and find accurate reference works to look this stuff up. So this is very hard. If you wanted to write a historical novel right now, you could do a decent job. Actually, you'd still probably make mistakes if you were writing about a very specific time and place. But you could do a pretty decent job with all of the opportunities we have for referencing. If you wanted to know, what would you smell if you stepped inside Canterbury Cathedral in England? You could actually probably look that up, okay? But that would be very difficult to look up these kinds of things. So they're very hard. And there's a lot more. So today I can only give you a small part of the evidence for the reliability of the Gospels. Please don't think this is all of it. But what you can do is you can have these in your pocket. And if somebody says, how is your holy book different from these other holy books? You can say, well, I heard this talk, and let me just give you a couple. And sometimes that's what you need, is something to move the conversation along, to just not feel like, I didn't expect the person to ask that question. I don't have anything. Just you need something to have to keep the conversation going and to look like you were not just completely caught flat-footed. So we're going to dive right in. Now, I talked about subtlety. The first thing I'm going to read you here is actually not going to be subtle on the part of Luke. Luke clearly is really pleased with all of these names that he has. I hope you will put up with my taking off my glasses, putting them on. It's another reason that other microphone wasn't going to work. I would have been knocking it off over and over again. So I'm going to read you Luke 3. I'm just going to go ahead and read verses 1 and 2 just to start with. John the Baptist is just beginning to have his ministry at this point in the Gospel of Luke. And Luke is nailing down in about 6 or 7 different ways here, the beginning of the ministry of John the Baptist. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, and Herod being Tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip Tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias Tetrarch of Abele, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, the son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. Okay. So if you ever wondered when John the Baptist's ministry began, just ask Luke. He knows. He knows in a lot of different ways. Now, every single one of those names provides confirmation, but because I want to get to a variety of verses and points tonight, I'm not going to talk about most of them. I'm just going to talk about one of them, and that is Lysanias, Tetrarch of Abele. Now, there was a Lysanias who was ruler of Abele. Abele's a little region in modern-day Syria. Indeed, it was called Syria then as well. And a tetrarch was a ruler underneath Rome. He was like a local appointed ruler. Well, we know about Lysanias, Tetrarch of Abele, only there's one small problem, which is that he died in the time of Mark Antony, which is about 35 years before Jesus was even born. Uh-oh. Now, surely, too much of a coincidence that there would be 2 people named Lysanias who would be tetrarch of the same little itty-bitty region. What it must be is that Luke got a little bit ahead of himself, right? And he just said, I'm going to impress people. I know Lysanias of Tetrarch of Abele, and I'll stick him in there. And oops, he was a good, 45, 50 years off, right? Nope. Luke did not make a mistake. in the 1800s, after all this time of skeptics going, Luke messed up, Luke made a mistake, etc., they discovered an inscription in that region dedicating a street, and I won't go into all the details, but when that street was built, the person who dedicated it referred to himself as a freedman of Sanius, Tetrarch of Abele, and there is a reference to the rulers of all of Rome at that time, the Augusti, that shows that it was right at this time that Luke is talking about, in the time of Tiberius Caesar. So there was another Lysanias. Probably he was the son of the first guy. So it's probably not a complete coincidence, but you know that if Christians had theorized that, they would have been mocked. You're just making that up to, save your holy book. And it turns out, guess what? Now, do you think that Luke, went and ran out there and found this inscription and said, I'm going to stick this guy in my... No, of course not. He had no way of knowing, that the one Lysanias would be forgotten years later and the other one would be remembered. He just put it in there because he knew. Okay, so that's an example of the little things. And look how hard it would be to get that right if you didn't just know. Here's another one. I just read through Luke 3:2, he says the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. Looks like there's two high priests at the same time. Yeah, it looks like that in John 11:49. He refers to Caiaphas. He was high priest that year. He says that again in John 18. In John 18:19 and 18:24, we can tell that John is referring to Annas as high priest. That's who he's referring to in 18:19. The high priest. And then in 18:24, he says, Annas sent him to Caiaphas, the high priest. So it looks like John is also saying there were two high priests at the same time. Could there be more than one high priest at the same time in Jewish law? Now, Numbers 35:25, which I didn't have printed on here, but it's about the cities of refuge, and it's not the only Old Testament verse that kind of looks like there could only be one high priest at a time, and that he ruled for his whole life, not just for, that year, and that year he wasn't, or something like that. So did Luke and John make a mistake? Again, there have been skeptics who have said that. They didn't even know they weren't just high priests for 1 year. And he didn't know that there couldn't be two at once. One guy said it would be like saying there were two archbishops of Canterbury at once. They obviously didn't know what they were talking about. Well, nope. So Josephus is that same Jewish author I mentioned to you before. He explains that the Romans changed the high priest. They recognized the high priest was a very powerful person, and they wanted somebody in there that they got along with. But at the same time, they knew that the Jews liked it to remain in certain families. So you may remember from the Gospel of John that Annas was Caiaphas' father-in-law. So, they would change it, but they would kind of keep it within. They wouldn't just pick somebody from like the wrong tribe of Israel or something like that. They would pick somebody the people wouldn't revolt over. But you could definitely have more than one person alive at the same time who at some point in his life had been called high priest. But it's more than that. Josephus actually uses the word high priest in a passage for two of these people who were alive at the same time. Because one guy had been a high priest, this is later than the time of Jesus, about 30 years later, and had been, deposed by the Romans, and he was still hanging around and causing trouble, as a matter of fact. And then there was somebody else who was appointed by the Romans, and they were both alive at the same time, and Josephus refers to them both as high priests, exactly the same way that John does and that Luke does. And that's how the term was used, because people would remember. Okay. Notice how casual John's references are. Luke isn't particularly casual. He's kind of showing off. But John is casual. John just says, and Annas sent him to Caiaphas. Now, the high priest, they took him to the house of the high priest. He sent him to the high priest. He's just telling his story. right? John isn't trying to show off anything. He doesn't know what people are going to remember or not remember about whether you could have two high priests at the same time. That's not the point. He's talking about Jesus' trial before these men. And so as he tells the story, he uses the words naturally because he knows how it worked. Here's another one. There are so many of these that I had trouble choosing when I was preparing for tonight. I really did. I had trouble picking. The pool of Bethesda. John 5:2 is going to tell the story about Jesus healing a man, right? A lame man at that pool who had been lying there for all these years, wanting to be healed, and nobody would help him down into the water and so forth. And he mentions that it had 5 roofed colonnades, it says in the translation that you have printed in your handout there. Some translations say porticos or porches. Again, John isn't making any big deal about this. He's just saying there's this pool and it's near the sheep gate and this is what it's like. And people were brought, probably, if it was going to rain, their relatives would bring them, put them under there so they wouldn't get rained on or whatever while they waited. And so he's just telling his story. This didn't exist anymore to be seen after AD 70, when Jerusalem was destroyed. It's quite probable, in my opinion, that the Gospel of John was written by John in his old age, John, Jesus' disciple, after that time. And so he's remembering what it was like. Now, one liberal critic in the middle of the 20th century said maybe John made up the 5 porches as a symbol of the 5 books of the law of Moses, and that Jesus healed the man because Jesus is better than the Old Testament, blah, blah, blah. It's like an allegory or something. New Testament critics do this all the time. There's one place where there's green grass, and I've seen a New Testament critic who says maybe this refers to he makes me lie down in green pastures. Not just that the grass was in fact green on the day when Jesus fed the 5,000 people. So did John make up the 5 porches? Nope. Archaeologists have, in fact, this was later than the middle of the 20th century, more recently, they've actually found the remains of that pool. And even though obviously the porches are all broken down, but they can tell that it had these 5. It was 2 on each side and 1 across the middle. So John was just telling the story the way it really happened. Here's one. Can you see me if I sit down here for a minute? That gonna work? If I sit down like this? Okay, all right, cool. The water pouring ceremony. So this is in John 7, 37 to 38. And it refers to Jesus' standing up on the last day of the feast. This is the feast of Sukkoth. We've actually just finished that feast in the Jewish New Year in September, the Feast of Tabernacles. And he said, if anyone thirsts, let him come unto me and drink. He that believes in me, as the scripture says, from his innermost being will flow rivers of living water. And that's exciting to us. And we love that. We memorize that. We think about living water. Okay, is there anything other than just Jesus making a metaphor? There actually is. So this isn't in the Old Testament. You can't learn about that from reading the Old Testament. So if someone was, later on reading up on it or something, he would not find this ceremony in the Old Testament. It developed in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, this elaborate ceremony where the priests would take water from the pool of Siloam, which, by the way, has also been found by archaeologists, which is living water. It comes from the Gahan spring from outside of Jerusalem. It was built in the time of Hezekiah and comes in so that if the city were besieged, they would have a supply of water. So living water means it's not just a pool that collects rain or whatever. It's actually welling up from down in the bottom of the pool. And they would take that from that pool, and then they would bring it and they would pour it over the altar in the temple. This isn't something God commanded. This is just something they developed for that feast. And they had candles that people would hold, and people would, in fact, wave palm branches. I can maybe talk about that later, relating it to Palm Sunday. But it was such a big deal that one rabbi actually says, he who never saw the ceremony of the water pouring never saw celebration in his day. And, of course, a lot of people never saw it because there was no temple anymore after AD 70, and there was no altar, and it was all defiled and destroyed, and so they weren't taking that water from the pool of Siloam and pouring it over. Now, John doesn't stop to explain it. John's probably writing his gospel over in modern-day Turkey. Several decades later, after none of this is happening anymore, he has Gentile readers. He probably has Jewish readers who are too young to have ever seen this. And he's just remembering what Jesus did and how Jesus stood up and said this on the last day of the feast. It's clear this is what Jesus is alluding to. Once you hear about that ceremony and what a big deal it was to them, you can tell it's what Jesus is, he's using it as an example. Living water springing up. But, John doesn't even stop to say, oh, wait, they won't have heard of that. I'd better stop and I better give a... No, he's just remembering what Jesus said. Okay, here's a quick one. John 11:18. This is the story of Lazarus, the raising of Lazarus and how he had died. And it just says, Bethany was close to Jerusalem, about 15 furlongs away. That's about 2 miles away. Now, John's just bringing this up to tell why so many people came to comfort Mary and Martha. So they had their friends, in Jerusalem. And this is still a custom of Orthodox Jews today. It's called Tisit Shiva. After the person is buried, you actually have a week. I'm not sure I would necessarily want this. I think I'd kind of want to be quiet, have a little privacy. But it was considered that you wanted your friends to come, and they would come and sit with them. I believe it's for 7 days, if I recall correctly. So that's what they did. And so John's explaining, okay, there were a lot of people. So that's why there were a lot of people there then when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. And that's why he mentions it. Well, we can actually confirm this. There's a village. It's been there as long as, anyone can remember of it. It's the village of Al-Izariah, the place of Lazarus, the traditional location of Bethany and of the tomb of Lazarus. It's there on the slopes of the Mount of Olives, just about 2 miles from Jerusalem. So there you go. And John just mentions it as part of his story. Many came to comfort them, the 2 sisters. Here's a fun one. I'm going to actually read this one. This is in a passage known as the Woes to the Pharisees. Jesus really gets on a roll here in Matthew. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. Okay, so he's saying that the Pharisees of the time are bothering about tithing mint and dill and cumin. Now, those of us ladies who cook, or anybody who cooks, with mint and dill, whether it's the dill seed or whether it's the dill weed, imagine having to tithe that, okay? To figure out how much dill weed do I have to give 1/10 of it. What are you going to have to do? Well, I guess you're going to use some tiny little scale or something, right? And, weigh it up, and okay, I guess about 1/10 of it is about this much. I mean, I buy it in a little thing, it's like says 0.5 of an ounce or something on it. It's tiny, tiny amounts. So that's going to be very, very nitpicky to have to weigh mint and dill and cumin. And so Jesus is actually sort of making a play on words. Okay, you tithe your mint and dill and cumin, the light things, but you neglect the heavy things, the important things, which are justice and mercy and faithfulness. I want to just note here that this is what Jesus is like, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but Jesus likes to comment on the lack of perspective that the Pharisees have, or the teachers of the law have, and he likes to use plays on words when he does that. Just like we have here, the light things and the heavy things, the light things and the weighty things. When he heals the woman in Luke, and I haven't had this printed for you, but if you remember the story, she's been bent over, unable to straighten up, and they're upset. Why? Because he healed on the Sabbath, right? And he says, well, on the Sabbath, you will untie your animal to take it to get a drink. That's supposed to be okay. That's not working on the Sabbath. Should I not have untied this daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound these 18 years? So he's showing that they really have their priorities backwards, but he likes to use untie and untie, just like here he likes to use light and heavy, but these are in different gospels. So I think that's interesting because it shows the way Jesus' mind works, and this is more evidence of the truth of the gospels, because it's the same man. It's that same man, and that's how his mind works, but they're totally different stories. It's just a pattern of thinking that he has. Okay. But guess what? They really did. They really did. There are passages, we find them in the Talmud, where they're literally saying, okay, this is when you have to tithe the seed of the coriander. If the entire plant was being grown, you were going to use the whole plant, then you have to tithe the whole plant. But if it was only being grown for the seeds, then you only have to tithe the seed. And some people believe that you have to tithe black cumin, but this other rabbi said you don't have to tithe black cumin. I mean, literally, okay? And this is what you do. This is how you tithe dill. And if you put it into your hand, before you eat it, whether you have to tithe it or not, every little rule. So Jesus and Matthew, in reporting Jesus, are not just kind of making up or exaggerating what these people actually argued about. We have other records. And notice what I mean by it's the little things. It's the little things. Who would have thought that this passage about tithing mint and dill and cumin would provide a confirmation of the truth of the Gospels? And that's not somebody saying, today's edition of the Jerusalem Times, we are going to tell about how a teacher named Yeshua rode in on a donkey. Yes, folks, that's right, a donkey. That's not what we find, and that's not what we should expect to find. But what we find is that they're so rooted in the culture of the times that when Jesus is rebuking the Pharisees, he's talking about something that the Pharisees actually did talk about. Okay, here's one. We haven't printed a verse because there'd just be too many of them. And if you're familiar with the Gospels, you know the Garden of Gethsemane. That was where Jesus went to pray, and it said he often went there with his disciples. Well, what does the name mean? It's a word in Aramaic. It means oil press. And the Gospels never mentioned that it means this. I got that information from the scholar Peter J. Williams. He has a little book called Can We Trust the Gospels? It's a really good book. I recommend it. And he mentions this in there. Well, guess where the Gospels say Gethsemane was on the Mount of Olives. Now, in peasant cultures where they harvest olives and they use them for olive oil, they don't have factories. They're not going to take the olives and take them miles and miles away to crush them for the olive oil. They're going to have the press right there, and it's going to be a couple of big stones, probably driven around by a donkey, and you're going to have like a little channel that the olive oil is going to run down as the olives get crushed, okay, and collect that olive oil. That would be right there amidst these big old olive trees for the time of the harvest, and they'll take them and they'll pour them into the press. Now, the Gospels are just telling about Jesus going there. They don't even mention the name themselves, but the name fits with the place where they locate it when we know the name and we know the meaning of the name. Really cool. Okay. Now this next one, this is the last type of confirmation I'm going to do. I really want you to track with me here because it's a little more complicated, but it really rewards our investigation. It's really worthwhile. So I'm going to start with a question. Without looking it up, could you say what the top 5 American baby boy and baby girl names were in the year that you were born? You are not allowed to use Google. You are not allowed to use a baby name book. Or, I'll go easy. Could you say what the top 5 baby boy or baby girl names are now? Okay, in 2015. Now, I couldn't. I would not know the answer to that question. In fact, even if you just allowed me to say one of the top 5, I would probably get it wrong. Now, not just somewhere in America, I want you to say in Michigan. What was one of the top 5 baby boy names in Michigan in the year 2020? I mean, maybe I'd get it right, but probably not. Jewish scholars have investigated Jewish names throughout Jewish history. So these are not Christian scholars, but the Jews have a great interest in the history of their people. And so one of the things that they've done is that they've gone to things like inscriptions, documents, deeds to houses, burial boxes. Those are called ossuaries, and they have the names of the people who are buried in there. They're written on the side and so forth. And then they've gotten statistics on these for different regions and different time periods, including the time of Jesus and including the region in which he lived. And it turns out, we might just unthinkingly, I certainly would have thought before I learned more about this, that, the Jews throughout the Roman Empire, they probably all named their kids Moses or maybe Ephraim or something, the 12 tribes of Israel or something like that. Names out of the Old Testament probably would be pretty similar among Jews all over the Roman world. And that turns out to be wrong. It turns out to be false. In Egypt, in the time of Jesus, the number 1 male name was Sabbateus. I mean, that's not even a name in the Old Testament, okay? But that was the number 1 male Jewish boy name among Egyptian Jews at the time of Christ. You'll notice we don't find anybody named Sabbateus in the Gospels, not a single person. So, well, what were the ones in Jesus' time? Have you ever noticed all the people named Simon in the New Testament? I mean, there's a lot of them, especially if you include the book of Acts. We have Simon Peter, right? Simon of Cyrene, Simon the leper, Simon the tanner. I'm probably forgetting some. Pardon? Simon the magician. There we go. Yep. Very good. And Mary's. So we have Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary, the sister of Lazarus in Bethany, Mary of Magdala. Magdala was a town up near the Sea of Galilee, Mary Magdalene. There's a woman, poor lady, she was just called the other Mary. I got so many of them. The other Mary. I think she's probably the same lady who is called Mary of James and Joseph, either the mother or possibly the sister of James and Joseph. It just says Mary of James and Joseph. Let's see, am I forgetting any other Marys right at the moment? But that's quite a few in a small number of total names. A lot named Mary. I mean, you ever think to yourself, like, what, were they just not very creative at that time, or what? Okay. Well, it turns out Simon and Mary were the top male and female names, respectively, in that region among Jews at that time, based upon this larger survey that the Jewish scholars have done of documents and so forth. I mean, that's just astounding. Do you know how hard it would be to get that right, either by accident or on purpose, among 4 different Gospels and, throw in the book of Acts? What are you going to do? You're going to sit down and get together. Okay, tell you what. I'll have a Simon in my story, and he'll be this Simon. You have a different Simon in your story, and you have yet another Simon in another story. And 2,000 years from now, when people are trying to figure out if we're right or wrong, and they figure out that Simon was the number 1 name, they're going to be so impressed. Well, obviously not. Okay, the gospel authors, they're just telling their stories, right? They're just telling that Jesus was anointed by the sinful woman in the home of Simon. One guy named Simon. Oh, yeah, that guy's probably different, actually. Probably a different Simon from Simon the leper, in whom he was anointed by Mary of Bethany, because actually I think those are 2 different events. So they're just telling their stories, right? And Peter, nobody really called him Simon much. Once he became the leader of the Christians, he was just known as Peter. But that's just who he was. That was just his name. So it comes up completely naturally, and they're woven right into their stories. Mary of Bethany is the sister of the man whom Jesus raised from the dead. John doesn't tell you her name to impress you. He tells you her name because she was the sister of Lazarus, and he's telling you the story of Lazarus. So either to do it on purpose, much less to do it by coincidence, this would be very hard. All right. One more aspect of this name thing. What would we do if we didn't have last names? You probably know several people named Bob. I certainly know several people named William or Bill. Okay? That's what we have last names for. Well, probably if we didn't, we would use other descriptions. Bob from church. Bob the mechanic. Bob from Mattawan. Bob, Jim's son. And this, in fact, is where many of our own last names in English come from, because English didn't used to have last names. So if you think about Williamson, William's son, right? Or Wheeler, and that would have been what the person did. So if you had a common first name, then people would attach some other description to you to be able to keep track of which one you were with that common first name, right? Well, that's what they did at the time as well. At the time of Jesus, you will find, so that's why we have Mary Magdalene, because Mary was such a common name that they had to indicate her some other way. Which Mary? Mary of the town of Magdala. Simon Peter, in other words, Simon, who was also known as Peter. It's not like Peter was his last name. They didn't have last names. That would be what I might call your extra name. Your, scholars call it disambiguator. To distinguish one from another. So this is where we're going to get to Matthew 10, 2 through 4. So this is really cool. So stay with me with this here. I got this from Peter Williams as well. This is the list of the 12 disciples of Jesus. It's such a great little exercise to do. Okay, so what we're going to find is that the common names in this list generally do not have any extra name. There's like one where there's an extra reason to describe him a little further, and that's Andrew. But generally, the common names have no extra reason. The uncommon names don't have any extra name. I misspoke. But the common names do have an extra name. So you got that? If a first name is common, you need an extra name. If a first name is uncommon, you probably don't need an extra name because you probably don't know a lot of people by that first name. So let's see how this works in the list of the 12. All right, here we go. The names of the 12 apostles are these. First, Simon, who is called Peter. So what did I just say? What rank was Simon? Come on, yeah. 1. It was the number 1 boy's name at the time. So we've got to have an extra name. Simon, who was called Peter. All right. And Andrew, his brother. Now, Andrew was not a very common name, but, he had a famous brother. So we're going to throw in there that he was Peter's brother. James, the son of Zebedee. All right. James was number 11 in the rankings. That's still pretty far up there. And you'll see we have 2 of them right here among the 12 disciples. So we need an extra name. So we're going to call him son of Zebedee. James, the son of Zebedee. And John, his brother. So both because he was his brother, but also John was number 5. So that's pretty common. So he gets an extra name. All right. Philip was number 61 in that region. So don't worry about that. It's a Greek name. They didn't know a lot of Philips, so he doesn't need an extra name. Bartholomew was number 50. You're not going to know a lot of Bartholomews. Sorry. Bartholomew doesn't get an extra name. Thomas is so uncommon that it doesn't get a ranking. I mean, it's so uncommon that, in fact, the New Testament scholar Richard Bauckham thinks it may not have been a name at all. He thinks it may have actually been a word for twin, because sometimes Thomas is described in Greek as the twin. So he doesn't get another name. And Matthew, the tax collector. Well, of course, he's the guy writing this, so maybe he got a little fun out of putting it in there. But also, Matthew was number 9, so that's pretty common. So he gets an extra name. James, the son of Alphaeus. Anybody remember what I just said a minute ago, what rank James was? 11. Now, so that's, common enough. He needs another name. Thaddeus, 39. So he doesn't need another name. In fact, it's probable that Thaddeus is named differently as Judas, the son of James, in Luke 6:16 in his list of the 12. When you match them up, it comes out. And once, Judas Iscariot betrayed Jesus, he probably didn't want to be known as Judas. Plus, Judas was number 4 ranking. So it would be easier if he took a different name. So Thaddeus. All right, here we go. Simon the Zealot. Simon, again, is number 1. So he needs an extra name. All right, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Judas needs another name because, Judas was number 4. Scholars don't agree on whether that referred to a place. It may very well have referred to a place. That's not the point. It's an extra name to tell you which Judas they're talking about. And when John, telling about the night that Jesus was betrayed, tells about a different Judas asking Jesus a question, he says, Judas, not Iscariot. That guy wanted to be sure everybody knew. Not that Judas. Okay, now, this little exercise is a little picky, but I hope you can see how remarkable it is that you go through the list of the 12 disciples and the common names get disambiguators. They get extra names, and the uncommon names don't. And you wouldn't know that unless this research had been done into which names were common and uncommon. Matthew isn't doing it that way. He just knows that's what these guys were called. All right, he just knows that among themselves, they said, James, son of Alphaeus. Hey, James, son of Alphaeus, get over here. All right, he just knows because he lived with them. He worked with them. This is how they were known, and the way they were known arose naturally out of the time and the culture. This all leads to the wrap-up, which is that faith and reason are a team. You never need to think of faith and reason as being separate or being in conflict with one another. They work together. This is just like the tiny tip of the iceberg that tells us that our faith is founded on fact. Like I said, it's a part of a part. In fact, I could say it's a part of a part of a part of the evidence for the truth and the reliability of the Gospels. Faith doesn't have to be blind. The Apostle Paul, in one of his speeches in Acts, says God has not left himself without witness. So God moved the evangelists to write Gospels. Now, we have epistles, and those are great too, but he specifically moved them to write this type of book, which was a gospel, to give us a different kind of evidence of the truth of what we know, a crucial kind of evidence that you're not going to get in the same way from an epistle. I've written 3 books that are out there. I'm just going to give you the titles. This will go by fast. You can ask me to repeat them afterwards, but this is in the order they were written: Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts; The Mirror or the Mask, Liberating the Gospels from Literary Devices. And I want to say right here, Emmanuel has been very helpful to me for that, because they helped me in 2020 with Pastor Bookstein's help to do a response series defending that book, The Mirror or the Mask. And most recently published this past March, and just at the beginning of October, it came out in Kindle, The Eye of the Beholder, the Gospel of John as Historical Reportage. So that's just on John. I have a YouTube channel. You can Google it up, Lydia McGrew, and that's just not very creative, but that's what it's called, Lydia McGrew YouTube channel. And hopefully, Lord willing, I'm hoping to write a book called Testimonies to the Truth, Why You Can Trust the Gospels. That's meant to be on a popular level, and what I've given you here tonight is supposed to be in there. And I'm hoping to actually have like a study guide to go with it, so it could be used in Sunday school and things like that. And I would appreciate your prayers that the Lord would help me to finish that, because I've been having some health challenges this year, as Pastor Bookstein mentioned. So I think we're going to take a little break here and then go to Q&A, right? Cool.
Thank you so much. We're going to let Lydia get her breath and sit down for a moment. Why don't we stand together, and we're going to sing just 3 verses from song number 243. The song is How Firm a Foundation we have as God's saints in God's excellent word. So we can stand right now, stretch your legs a minute. And let's sing 1, 2, and 6 of 243. And while we're singing, Joshua, I'm going to put on the head-worn mic for the Q&A, so Lydia can hold this and all the others. If you could get that going, that'd be great. Thank you. So think of any questions you have. If I could I put a question to you, Tim? So Tim McGrew, professor of philosophy at Western Michigan University. We have several high school students here, quite a few high school students or college-age students. How would you, what does it take for a Christian student to remain Christian in college, in university? And maybe you could even say something about the apologetics group that you're part of, but
this was not prepared. He's putting me on the spot.
He's putting you on the spot, right.
I'll shoot from the hip on this one. The very first thing that I want to say is what you shouldn't do. I see a lot of Christian kids come to college, and college is new, college is exciting, college is terrifying, and they get so busy and so wrapped up in it that they stop going to church, to their church. Maybe they've moved there and they don't find a church. This is bad. Don't do that. You are not going to do this as a lone cowboy. That's the wrong way to do it. You're not supposed to try to go it alone. Too many people get out there and they say, oh, I got to figure out this whole thing on my own. No, you don't. There are people who are willing to help you, and ground zero for that is a good local church. So, if you go locally to church, don't stop going to the church you've been going to. If you move away to go to college, don't do that without trying to tie into a good local church. Find that. That's point number one. Point number two is there are Christians almost anywhere you go. Any university. Yes, the universities are secular. Yes, a lot of your professors are, at the very best, not interested in your Stone Age superstitions or whatever they're going to call them. Fact check. Even the Old Testament is late bronze to early iron, so no. But anyway, they've got, there are plenty of people out there who are not interested in your faith or are interested in taking it away, but there are also Christian professors, there are Christian students. Tie in with them, not as a substitute for your church, but in addition. It's helpful to have other students who are going through the process like you are. It's helpful to know professors. I mean, they're supposed to be, like, smart or something, right? And this is an important plug for having some means of finding out who the Christian professors are on your campus. Because I got to tell you, if the only forces pulling on a young person going to college are my pastor and my professor, and the professor's pulling the opposite direction, this is a bad vector addition. This doesn't work well, right? Because what's somebody going to say? Wow, so my pastor says I can trust the Bible, and my professor says it's all just a bunch of legends, and my pastor gets paid because he's supposed to say that, and my professor gets paid to be smart. I wonder which one I'll take more seriously. The best you can hope for is that they'll walk away saying, who knows? Find some professors. There are people out there who are knowledgeable, who have heard the arguments, all the way from Jesus never existed. That's one of my favorites. That's like wild. There are people out there who actually believe that. Woo! Okay, don't know much about history. Or people who are going to say, oh, well, the Gospels, they're just full of contradictions. You really want to talk to somebody who's worked through that. That brings me to the third point. On many campuses, there are actually Christian groups not just designed for fellowship and loud music, but actually designed to answer those kinds of questions specifically. So even on Western's campus, we have a group called Ratio Christi, the Reason of Christ. And that is specifically an apologetics campus ministry designed to allow Christians to come and share the questions they're running into, talk about evidence, allow unbelievers to come in and ask their questions and get straight answers, not evasive answers, not shuffling feet. Well, you're supposed to have faith. No, straight up answers, like you've been seeing here. So those three things. Don't forget to tie into a local church. Connect with Christian students and faculty, and on many campuses, you can actually find a group like Ratio Christi that's specifically devoted to that. That's not all the advice I have to give, but he put me on the spot, so blame him.
For Lydia on this talk in particular, or on the Gospels, and can we, branch into Acts if you need to. But
we can
any
go.
questions? Any questions for Lydia? Yep.
Here, you know what we're going to do? Let's take...
The question is, does Josephus believe in the resurrection?
No. No, definitely not. Is this on?
It's on, yeah.
Okay. No, Josephus was a Jew. And he was a Jew until, the end of his life. He was a Roman Jew. He was Roman sympathetic. I don't know, you may possibly have seen what's called the interpolated text. There actually was, I'm afraid, some Christians who got overly enthusiastic, and they did insert some stuff into it's pretty obvious now, into the text of Josephus. If he can even be called merely a man, and he kind of goes on and on and on. And that section of it, we've actually found texts without that. So he only says something much briefer about Jesus. In fact, he has more to say about James. He tells about the death of James, Jesus' brother, who was better known as a Jew in the 60s, which is closer to the time when Josephus is writing. So no, he did not believe in the resurrection. So what I'm going to do is because Pastor Bookstein's hearing is better than mine, he'll probably repeat the question. Cool. So.
Another question? Yeah, Ryan.
How do you answer the objection that the Bible was just kind of haphazardly slapped together at the Council of Nicaea?
Okay, how do you answer the objection that the Emperor Constantine, demanded the Bible books be agreed upon, and it was slapped together at the Council of Nicaea?
Right. Okay. That you do hear that, and kind of winners write the history books, and those were the winners, and so forth. Actually, we know that that's not true because the New Testament books were being chosen prior to that to be read in the churches, and they needed to have the authority of an apostle behind them. And so for long before the Council of Nicaea, you find lists of the books and discussions of, okay, this one should not be read in the churches because we don't know who wrote it or because we don't know that it has apostolic authority. Way back, probably the earliest time that we find the Gospels authors named as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John would be around the year 180. But that's actually pretty early for an ancient book for us to still have. There probably were earlier namings, but for us to still have things that name them, that's doing pretty good because that's less than 100 years after the New Testament canon was closed. So they didn't read them in the church if they didn't have reason to believe in their authority. This is sort of following the Jewish function. So the Christian ecclesia or church kind of modeled itself on the Jewish gatherings in the synagogue, and they would read the Old Testament in the Jewish gatherings in the synagogue. So something had to be thought of as scripture in order to be read. And if they were going to add to that Old Testament set, then they wouldn't think of it as scripture if it didn't have an apostle right there. So like Mark was under the authority of Peter, Luke under the authority of the Apostle Paul. And if they hadn't known that, they wouldn't have read them. And that's why you even find in Justin Martyr, this is around the year 100. So we're here right around the time that John died. Okay, so we're getting right back there. Justin Martyr says that they read from the memoirs, that's what he called the Gospels, of the apostles and their companions. So the apostles would be Matthew and John, even though he doesn't name them, and their companions would be Luke and Mark. So it definitely was not thrown together later at the Nicaea was just a time when they're coming together and they're talking about things, but things that were already known. Tim has something he wants to add. Go ahead.
We're good. Okay. Let me just add to what Lydia has said that there were sub-collections of parts of our New Testament that circulated as collections. So we have a document from the first third of the 2nd century, around the 130s, called the Apology of Aristides. It's addressed to the Emperor Hadrian, and it tells first that, the Christians know they're not drinking blood, they're not sacrificing babies, they're not doing these terrible things, they're actually good citizens, because he has to answer the slanders of the time. And then he tells how the Christians got their name and whom they worship, and it's this Jesus who came down from heaven and lived and taught and died and rose again. And then Aristides says, and you may read more, O king, of the renown of his character in the evangelical holy scriptures. So he's referring to a collection of the evangelists circulating. From the language he's just used, it's pretty clear that John is included in them. And that circulates as a body. There was also a collection of letters of Paul that circulated as a collection. If you're interested in this, talk to me afterward. I will get you, just give me your email, and I will send you an old book. It's out of copyright, no piracy necessary, that goes through the historic evidence for the authorship and transmission of the books in the New Testament. And these are points that the author, Samuel Tregelles, makes. So there's actually an excellent body of evidence to refute the Nicaea kind of objection. And I'm glad that you raised that.
Another question? Okay, are there other historical figures that talk about Jesus and or Christians?
There are. There's, for example, Tacitus, who was a Roman, who talks about the persecution of the Christians under the Emperor Nero, if I've got this right. Yes. So we've got, like I said, Josephus mentions the existence of Jesus. We've got, there's a letter that was written to the Emperor Trajan that talks about the persecution of the Christians, and it was from this guy Pliny, and he's like, do I really have to persecute these people, and what's the deal? And I'm paraphrasing, but the point is, because he said, and I got a hold of two of the women, and I tortured them, and all I could get from them was that they sing a hymn to this guy Jesus as a god. And, they meet and everything. It just doesn't really seem to be anything that wrong with them. So what do I do? I mean, he thought nothing of torturing them. But the point is, yes, we have quite early records of Jesus being worshipped by the Christians. But again, as I explained in my talk, that's not actually our best outside evidence of the truth of the Gospels. And the Gospels, just as evidence for the existence of Jesus, are overwhelming. Because even if you don't think of them as inspired at all, they're four books by completely different people talking about how this guy walked around and the things that he did. So there's really the position that Jesus did not exist, or that Christianity did not get started until way later or whatever. It's just like completely out of there. Historically, it has nothing to commend it whatsoever. So yes, there are some other groups, and it depends too on how far you want to go back. I mean, obviously you get to the 200s and the 300s, you get more and more and more Christian authors that are even preserved to us, developing and arguing about their doctrine and so forth. But if you're talking about down really close to the time, we do have several mentions, yes, of the existence of very, very early primitive Christianity.
Another question? Yes.
So to go along with that, isn't it also true that we have, like, there are other historical figures that are not disputed at all, with much less proof of their existence? Follow me? Like the world will accept other stuff, other people, and what they did as fact, with less proof than what you just described.
So like Julius Caesar, for example, now people will talk about the fact that Caesar himself wrote the Gallic Wars, whereas Jesus himself didn't write any books. But yes, I mean, that's absolutely true. Socrates would be another example. We've got two different of people who knew him. We've got his student Plato, and then we've got who? Thank you, Xenophon, who met him. who actually met him and then went off and became a war correspondent in Persia. This is actually true. So anyway, we've got two people who knew Socrates, but we've got, 4 different documents about Jesus. So that's certainly true, that we have, like I said, a remarkable number of documents for a single ancient person in the person of Jesus.
You ever had that married people where you're trying to think of that ancient Greek person's name, and then your spouse is like, oh yeah, Xenophon. So that's really fun to watch you guys do that. That's really cool. Good. Other questions? Okay, Fred, yeah.
Yeah, Lydia, you were talking about Sanius and the Pool of Siloam and how in the last 100 years we've kind of found some cool things. Is there anything that would be nice to find in the Gospels that are still kind of debated that we don't really have, like that street dedication?
Okay, you think? Okay, and like a place, for example. Good question. Well, there's the Tower of Siloam. That one's interesting. There's a place in Luke where Jesus says, "Do you think that those 18 on whom the Tower of Siloam fell were greater sinners than any others? No, but I say unto you that unless you repent, you will also likewise perish." So there are scholars who think we found the Tower of Siloam, and then there are others who say, no, I don't know if that was really the Tower of Siloam, and so forth. So yeah, it would be nice to be sure that we found the Tower of Siloam. There are several candidates for the location of Cana, and people don't agree. Now, they're all, like, really close to each other. They're all in the hills of Galilee, like right there. Kerbet Kana is probably is Cana, but we're not absolutely sure. So there are things where there's ambiguity. Ephraim, John refers to Jesus withdrawing. There are several places in John. I find this so fascinating. John is never in any doubt of the place that he's talking about, even if we cannot identify it. So he says Jesus went back to a region called Ephraim near the wilderness. Now, the church historian Eusebius thought he knew where Ephraim was, and then other people were like, nah, that's not where Ephraim was. And so it would be nice to know where that is, but John is in no doubt. Or Bethany beyond Jordan. It's fascinating. John knows that there's a Bethany. Well, he says where it is, right? We talked about it right here tonight, 2 miles from Jerusalem. That's obviously not it. And then there's a different one beyond the Jordan, which is where John the Baptist was baptizing at first. Well, it would be nice to find Bethany beyond the Jordan. But I kind of like these in a way because we haven't found them. I like it because what we see is you wouldn't expect to be able to find them all. But you find this effortless competence that John has. So if Kalamazoo and Portage were ever destroyed, you probably wouldn't be able to find the Shell station on the corner of Burdick and Cork Street. But if I wrote a story in which I said I went and got gas at the Shell station at the corner of Burdick and Cork Street, and somebody found it 2,000 years after Kalamazoo was destroyed, I would be showing that I knew what I was talking about, even though you couldn't find it. So I think it's pretty cool. Go ahead.
We're going to do this as a tag team. So beyond that, there is another kind of cool thing that Lydia didn't even bother to mention. And this is like evidence of what she was saying, that this is just a part of the evidence that we have. There's so much. At a certain point, I'm the son of a Bible college professor. I thought I knew this stuff, and I began actually looking into it at a certain point, and I felt like I was looking up at an avalanche of evidence coming down on my head. It was like, okay, I believe. But here's just one thing. If you look carefully in the Gospels, all this takes is a Bible, a pencil, and the willingness to put a little bit of attention into your reading. Look for all of the places in the Gospels where they say someone went up to some place or someone went down to some place. Those are little prepositions tucked into the verbs in the Greek, and they're flawless. right? He came down from Cana. A certain man went down to Jericho. Well, Jericho's still in the mountains, yeah, but it's downhill from Jerusalem. Right? The little ups and the downs, the topography indicated by those terms is flawless. It's absolutely amazing. Every place we can check it, it's right. What kind of a skeptic do you have to be to say, oh, well, maybe they're right in all the places you can check, but they're wrong everywhere else? Come on! Nobody does that in real life. So even just go through and look for that, and you'll find all these little topographical things. Even the great skeptic Ernst Renan in the mid-19th century lived in Palestine and said, yeah, okay, these guys did know the terrain. Whatever else we're going to say. I don't believe in miracles, but they definitely knew the terrain.
Just another minute or so, if there's another question. That's discouraging when a person says that, isn't it? Now you got to have a question real quick. She's got to give a quick answer. Could I ask you a question? It's a little different than some of the other questions that have been asked, but suppose one of us were asked by a neighbor, by a friend or family member, why are you a Christian? How would you answer that question? Why are you a Christian?
I'm a Christian because I have reason to believe that it's absolutely true. And because it's founded on this evidence such that I don't have to wonder anymore. Tim likes to read this quote. He's probably got it memorized. I'm just going to paraphrase it. But where a man said, if someone told me that there was a problem with the foundations of my house, I would take my lantern, this is when they had lanterns, and I would go, my lamp, and I would go down and I would shine my lamp on the places, especially noticing the one where the person had drawn a question to, and I would confirm that it was all okay, and then I would go upstairs and I would go to bed, and I wouldn't worry about it anymore but I would go and I would check. And, we're all going to face stuff that's going to be bad in life. Nobody gets through life without facing bad stuff. And so it's a good thing to know that when you go and you check, you can actually find that the truth is not something you just have to take a wild shot bet on. It's actually something that is supported by facts.
Then I'm going to pray, and then we're going to sing 2 verses from number 171, A Word of God Incarnate. The question is simply, how can we pray for you? You've not been well. There's a lot of people here who do pray, and we'd like to go home, and as the Lord gives us memory to do so, to pray for you. How could we do so?
Well, I appreciate that. So you can look up my YouTube channel. You can watch a video on there called Pain in the Silence of God. That one's on there and talks a little bit about what I've been facing since between April and May, very abrupt, which is nerve disease. And the doctors are baffled. I'll be going to the University of Michigan in February. I can't get in before February. I don't know if they're going to have any answers either. So pray for physical healing if that is the Lord's will, and regardless that I'll be able to finish this book that I'm writing, and for God to continue to strengthen my faith through this, whether it's His will to heal me or not to heal me, and also for Tim, who's been just an absolute rock through all of this, and I've been difficult to live with even more than usual, and that he would continue to be strengthened in all of this as well, because, we just don't know what's going on, and the doctors don't know what's going on, nobody but God does, and God knows what He's going to do. So just pray that He'd keep on strengthening us and heal if it's His will. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to pray, and then we'll stand and sing those 2 verses. Our Father in heaven, we thank you so much